David Sharp, a 34-year-old engineer from Cleveland, England, dreamed of conquering Mount Everest. In May 2006, he made his third attempt to summit the world's highest peak. Unlike most climbers, David decided to go alone, without a guide or Sherpa support, to save costs. He carried minimal supplies and relied on his own experience to achieve his goal. This decision, though bold, would ultimately lead to one of Everest's most controversial tragedies. David took the North Col route from Tibet, considered less crowded but equally dangerous. On May 14, 2006, he made his final push to the summit. He was climbing late in the season when conditions were less favorable. Despite the grueling climb and bitter cold, he managed to reach the summit, a monumental achievement for any climber. However, his descent into the death zone, altitudes above 8,000 meters, where oxygen is dangerously scarce, was fraught with difficulty. As he descended, David's oxygen supply ran dangerously low. Exhausted, frostbitten, and disoriented, he stopped near a rocky alcove below the summit, a site known as Green Boots Cave. The location was named after the body of another climber who had perished there years earlier, marked by his neon green boots. David sat down to rest, unaware that stopping in such brutal conditions could seal his fate. Hypothermia and lack of oxygen rapidly set in, leaving him immobile. By the morning of May 15, David was still alive but in critical condition. Climbers heading toward the summit found him slumped against the rocky wall. His breathing was shallow, his lips blue, and his body stiff with frostbite. Some climbers attempted to communicate with him, but he was incoherent. Others left oxygen tanks near him, but by then, he was too weak to use them. At such extreme altitudes, rescuing someone is nearly impossible without risking multiple lives. Faced with this grim reality, most climbers chose to continue their ascent, leaving David where he sat. Over 40 climbers passed David that day. Some paused briefly to check on him, while others walked by, unable to help. His condition worsened as the hours dragged on. When a group of Indian climbers encountered him later that day, David was unresponsive. They attempted to assist, but quickly realized there was nothing more they could do. His body had succumbed to the freezing temperatures and lack of oxygen. David Sharp's death became one of the most infamous tragedies in Everest's history. News of his death sparked outrage and intense debate. Critics questioned how so many climbers could walk past a dying man. Survivors and experienced mountaineers defended their actions, emphasizing the brutal reality of the death zone. Helping someone in such conditions often means risking your own life. Even minor delays can cost lives, and carrying someone down the mountain is nearly impossible without sufficient oxygen and manpower. David's body remained in Green Boots Cave for years, frozen in the seated position where he took his last breath. His death raised serious ethical questions about the balance between personal ambition and the moral responsibility to help others. Some argued that David's decision to climb alone and without enough oxygen was reckless, while others condemned the lack of humanity shown by those who passed him. Today, David Sharp's story serves as a haunting reminder of Everest's dangers and the high cost of human ambition. It is a stark warning that even the most experienced climbers are no match for the mountain's unforgiving conditions. The 1996 Everest disaster remains one of the deadliest events in mountaineering history, claiming the lives of 8 climbers during a devastating storm. Among those lost were Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Seattle, Yasuko Namba, a 47-year-old accomplished Japanese climber, and renowned guides Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. The tragedy exposed the dangers of overcrowding, poor decision-making, and the mountain's unforgiving conditions. In May 1996, Everest saw an unusually high number of climbers attempting to summit. 2 large expeditions, led by Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants and Scott Fisher of Mountain Madness, were among those aiming for the peak on May 10. Climbers began their final push from Camp Ivy in the early hours, hoping to summit by midday. However, delays at bottlenecks like the Hillary Step kept climbers in the death zone far longer than planned. Doug Hansen and Yasuko Namba reached the summit late in the afternoon, long past the recommended turnaround time. Hansen, already struggling, was accompanied by Hall, who refused to leave him behind. Yasuko, exhausted but determined, celebrated her achievement before beginning her descent. As the climbers descended, disaster struck. A fierce storm engulfed the mountain, bringing gale-force winds, blinding snow, and temperatures below -40 degrees Celsius. Visibility dropped to near zero, and many climbers became disoriented and stranded. Hansen collapsed near the Hillary Step. Rob Hall, unwilling to abandon his client, stayed with him, radioing for help. Despite efforts to send oxygen, the storm made a rescue impossible. Hansen succumbed to the cold overnight, and Hall, suffering from frostbite and exhaustion, made one final radio call to his pregnant wife, Jen, before freezing to death. Yasuko Namba collapsed near Camp Ivy alongside Beck Weathers, another climber. Weathers, suffering from severe hypothermia and snow blindness, was left for dead. Miraculously, he later staggered back to camp, but Yasuko, too weak to move, froze in the storm. Her body was discovered the next morning, partially buried in snow. Scott Fisher, who had struggled with illness during the climb, collapsed while descending from the summit. His team was unable to save him, and he died alone in the death zone. Other climbers, separated from their teams and out of oxygen, also succumbed to exposure and exhaustion as the storm raged through the night. By morning, the full extent of the disaster was evident. Survivors described the harrowing conditions, with bodies frozen in the snow and climbers barely clinging to life. Beck Weathers, though severely frostbitten, became one of the few miracles of the tragedy, though he later lost his hands and parts of his face to frostbite. The 1996 disaster exposed critical issues on Everest, including overcrowding inexperienced climbers, and the pressure to reach the summit at all costs. Delays at key points and poor decisions, like ignoring turnaround times, contributed to the tragedy. This harrowing event, later chronicled in John Krakauer's book Into Thin Air, remains a chilling reminder of Everest's dangers. It stands as one of the darkest moments in the history of mountaineering, where ambition collided with nature's brutal force. On May 10, 1996, Suang Paljor, a 28-year-old Indian climber, embarked on a perilous journey that would make him one of the most recognizable symbols of Mount Everest's deadly risks. A member of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, ITP expedition, Suang and his team aimed to become the first Indians to summit Everest via the North Col route from Tibet. Their mission carried immense national pride, but the unforgiving mountain had other plans. The climb began in the early hours of May 10. Suang, along with two teammates, Dorj Morat and Suang Samanla, ascended steadily despite increasing winds. The weather deteriorated as they neared the summit, but the group pressed on, determined to plant the Indian flag on top of the world. Around 3 p.m., they achieved their goal, briefly celebrating their historic accomplishment. The descent, however, would prove fatal. By the time the team began their return, the winds had strengthened to gale force, and a sudden storm engulfed the upper slopes of the mountain. The trio, already fatigued from the climb and suffering from oxygen deprivation in the death zone, where altitudes above 8,000 meters make human survival nearly impossible, struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain in the blizzard. Suang Paljor became separated from his teammates during the descent. Disoriented by hypoxia and blinded by the storm, he stumbled upon a rocky alcove at approximately 8,500 meters, now known as the Green Boots Cave. Clad in his neon green climbing boots, Suang huddled against the cold, seeking shelter from the relentless winds. His exhaustion and the sub-zero temperatures overtook him, and he froze to death in a seated position, his arms crossed over his chest. The storm also claimed the lives of Dorje Morup and Suwang Samanla. Only one member of the ITBP expedition, Harbhajan Singh, survived after turning back earlier in the climb due to worsening conditions. It was later determined that Suwang and his team had not been equipped with enough supplemental oxygen, a critical factor that likely sealed their fate. In the aftermath, Suwang's body remained in the alcove where he had fallen, unnoticed for some time. As more climbers began taking the North Col route in subsequent years, his frozen remains became a haunting landmark. Positioned along a narrow section of the trail just below the summit, Suwang's body, identified by his distinctive green boots, served as a grim waypoint for those attempting to reach the top. Over the years, climbers passing through the Green Boots cave would often pause to rest, their footsteps echoing the tragic irony of his final moments. Many question the ethics of leaving bodies on the mountain, but the extreme conditions of Everest make retrieval nearly impossible. Suwang's remains stayed in place for nearly 2 decades, a stark reminder of the mountain's deadly power. In 2014, reports surfaced that his body had disappeared. Whether it was moved out of respect, covered by shifting snow and ice, or carried away by natural forces remains unclear. Despite his physical absence, the story of Green Boots endures, a chilling symbol of the dangers posed by Everest's unforgiving environment. Suwang Palger's death, along with those of his teammates, highlights the risks climbers face when ambition collides with the harsh realities of extreme altitude. Their loss is a sobering testament to the thin line between triumph and tragedy on the world's highest peak.